Hello guys, this is Dark Fox Sage 2 and we are back with our new fanfic, which is What If Naruto and Tsunade Got Married to Rebuild Their Clan and Save Political Alliance Part 2. And if you enjoy this fanfic, then please press the like button and please subscribe to the channel. It motivates me to upload more fanfic like these for you all. Now let's start the fanfiction ## chapter 14, The Return of the Founders. The gates of the Hidden Leaf were always a welcome sight. But as Tsunade and Naruto walked through them this time, the atmosphere was different. The guards didn't just snap to attention, they stood straighter, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and relief. The word of the successful summit, and the rumored defeat of an ambush party in the Valley of Shadows, had preceded them. They didn't look like diplomats on a mission, they looked like legends returning from a war. Tsunade, clad in her travel-worn gear, walked with a stride that radiated absolute confidence. Beside her, Naruto walked with a quiet, grounded intensity. They weren't holding hands, but the space between them was charged with an intimacy that anyone watching could feel. They were a single unit. "Welcome back, Lady Fifth." "Welcome back, Naruto-sama," the guard at the gate said, bowing lower than protocol strictly required. Naruto offered a polite nod, his expression serene. Tsunade simply acknowledged them with a tilt of her head. As they walked through the village streets, the reaction was immediate. People stopped. Shopkeepers leaned out of their stalls. Children paused their games. The whispers weren't about the political marriage, the rumors, or the council's mandates. They were about the two figures who represented the absolute zenith of Konoha's strength. They didn't go to the Hokage Tower immediately. They didn't feel the need to report to the council like subordinates. They went to the Senju compound first. When they stepped through the heavy wooden gates, the silence of the estate greeted them like an old friend. The chaos of the outside world, the demands of the village, and the scrutiny of the elders vanished. "We're home," Naruto said softly, closing the gates behind them. Tsunade leaned back against the wood, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a profound sense of peace in its wake. She looked at Naruto, who was removing his cloak. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright, focused entirely on her. "The council is going to be waiting in the tower," Tsunade said, though her voice lacked any real urgency. "They'll want the details of the summit. They'll want to know how we handled the wreckage." Naruto walked over to her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space in the best way possible. "Let them wait. We secured the trade routes. We neutralized an assassin cell. We did our jobs. If they want the details, they can wait until after we've had a decent meal." Tsunade laughed, a genuine, melodious sound. "You're getting bold, Uzumaki." "I'm just being efficient," he teased, his hand coming up to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch feather light. "Besides, I think we've earned a moment of quiet." They spent the next few hours in a way that would have been unthinkable a few months ago. They cooked together in the kitchen, the process messy and disorganized, filled with laughter and teasing. They didn't talk about chakra, or missions, or politics. They talked about the village's future, about the small things. A new garden Naruto wanted to plant, a book Tsunade wanted to read, the mundane, beautiful details of a life they were finally building. That evening, when they finally climbed the stairs to the Hokage Tower, the mood in the council chamber was brittle. Homura and Kaharu were present, their expressions etched with the familiar, dour disapproval. They expected the arranged couple to arrive with tension, or perhaps the distance of two people who had just spent a long, forced trip together. Instead, they walked in as partners. Naruto didn't stand behind Tsunade. He stood beside her. And when Tsunade took her seat at the head of the table, Naruto didn't take the assistant's chair. He pulled up a seat next to her, his presence a clear, unwavering line in the sand. "The summit was a success," Tsunade began, her voice ringing with the authority of a Hokage who held all the cards. "The trade agreements are signed. The northern borders are secure. Any further attempts to sabotage Konoha's diplomatic efforts will be met with the full force of this village." She looked at Homura, her gaze piercing. And regarding our status, the union is finalized. It is a source of stability, not a political pawn for you to debate. My marriage is my own, and my position is secure. I suggest you focus on the village's reconstruction, as your input on anything else is no longer required. The council room was deathly silent. Naruto didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He just sat there, watching them with eyes that held the weight of the war and the sharpness of a guardian. He was the sword to her shield, the absolute deterrent that made any further manipulation impossible. The elders exchanged a look. There was nothing left to say. The trap they had set had transformed into their own obsolescence. As they walked out of the tower and back into the cool night air of the village, Tsunade felt a hand slip into hers. It was strong, calloused, and perfectly warm. "They're done," Naruto whispered, his voice low and content. "They are," she agreed, looking up at the moon hanging over the Hokage mountain. "They're finished." They walked back to the compound, not as a political arrangement, but as a family. The long road they had traveled, from the battlefield to the council chamber to the mountain passes, had brought them to the only place they ever needed to be, together. And for the first time in her long, storied life, Tsunade knew that the future wasn't something to be feared, or navigated, or survived. It was something to be lived. Chapter 15, The Unwritten Chapter. The sun rose over Konoha with a brilliance that seemed to reflect the shift in the village's spirit. The reconstruction was moving at a pace that defied expectations. The morale of the people was higher than it had been since the end of the war, and for the first time in years, the Hokage's office wasn't a place of desperate firefighting. It was a place of planning. Tsunade sat at her desk, reviewing blueprints for the new residential district, when a shadow fell across the paper. She didn't need to look up. She felt the change in the air, the warmth, the grounding presence. Naruto leaned over her shoulder, his hand resting on the back of her chair. He'd been spending his mornings at the academy, mentoring the new generation of genin, and he always returned with a faint, tired smile that made Tsunade's heart ache in the best way possible. "The expansion to the north is going well," Naruto murmured, his gaze tracing the lines of the architectural map. "The clan heads are finally cooperating, largely because they know who's reviewing their proposals." Tsunade leaned back, letting her head rest against him. "They're cooperating because they've realized that trying to manipulate us is a losing game. It's amazing what a little clarity of purpose does to village politics." Naruto chuckled, the vibration resonant against her back. "It helps that we stopped trying to be two separate entities and started being one. The Senju Uzumaki restoration isn't just a political buzzword anymore. People are starting to see it as a reality." Tsunade looked at the blueprints, the infrastructure, the parks, the homes. It was a future they were building from the rubble. "We have a lot to live up to, you know. The founders. Mito and Hashirama. Sometimes it feels like we're just walking in their footsteps." Naruto moved around the desk, pulling a chair close to hers. He took the pen from her hand, setting it aside, and took both of her hands in his. "We aren't walking in their footsteps, Tsunade," he said, his voice quiet and firm. "We're writing our own story. They built the foundation, but we're the ones deciding what kind of home this village is going to be. And it's not going to be a cold, formal place. It's going to be a home, for everyone." Tsunade squeezed his hands. The weight of the past, the tragedy, the lost potential, the heavy expectations of her bloodline seemed to lift. She wasn't just the fifth Hokage, the last Senju, the woman who had lost everything. She was Tsunade. And she was standing beside the man who had shown her that she could still build, still love, and still lead from the heart. "What do you want to do today?" she asked, a playful light entering her eyes. "Are we going to pretend to be dignitaries, or are we going to actually get something done?" Naruto grinned, that familiar, infectious smile that had first cracked the ice of her loneliness. "I have a meeting with the academy instructors, and then I'm planning on taking you to that new tea house in the Uchiha district. They're serving those almond cakes you like." "You remembered that?" "I remember everything, Tsunade," he said softly, leaning in to brush his forehead against hers. "Every promise. Every moment. every look. As they left the Hokage Tower together, walking down the steps into the bustling street, the villagers stopped. They didn't whisper about political unions or strategic marriages anymore. They watched them with a quiet respect, the Hokage and her partner, moving with the easy, natural rhythm of a team that had survived the impossible and found something permanent in the process. The Senju and the Uzumaki had once defined the history of the leaf. But as Naruto tucked a stray strand of blonde hair behind her ear and whispered a joke that made Tsunade laugh, a genuine, unburdened sound, it was clear that they were no longer looking back. The political storms had passed. The thread of the council had dissolved into history. Ahead of them lay a horizon of their own making, an unwritten chapter that they were going to fill, day by day, with the quiet, powerful strength of their own choosing. They walked toward the heart of the village, hand in hand, two legends who had finally found the one thing that mattered more than power, more than history, and more than the weight of their titles. They had found each other, and for the first time in their lives, that was more than enough. Chapter 16. The art of quiet. The Senju compound had changed. It was no longer the silent museum of ghosts that Naruto had stepped into months ago. It was filled with the clutter of a life being shared. Books stacked haphazardly on the tables, the scent of fresh tea, and the lingering sound of conversation that didn't revolve around village budgets or tactical defense. It was a Sunday, and for the first time in his life, Naruto had no mission, no training session, and no council meeting to attend. He found Tsunade in the central courtyard, sitting on the Ingawa, watching the koi in the pond. She looked peaceful, her hair falling over her shoulder in a loose braid. She wasn't wearing her signature green haori or her forehead protector. She looked smaller, in a way that had nothing to do with her stature and everything to do with the heavy, armored posture she usually kept. Naruto sat down beside her, his weight causing the wood to creak slightly. He brought 2 small bowls of dango, setting them between them. "You're awake," she said, not turning her head. Her voice was light, a stark contrast to the sharp, authoritative tone she used in the tower. "I am," he replied, taking a piece of dango. "It's dangerously quiet today. No reports of rogue ninjas, no trade route disputes, no elders trying to ruin our lives. I'm not sure I know what to do with myself." Tsunade turned to look at him, a soft, amused smile touching her lips. "Maybe you could try breathing, Uzumaki. I hear it's very popular these days." Naruto laughed, the sound warm in the cool morning air. "Funny." He looked out at the garden. The cherry blossoms were starting to bud, a sign that spring was finally settling in over Konoha. "Do you remember the first time we sparred, back when I first moved in?" Tsunade shifted, resting her chin on her hand. "The day of the monsoon? How could I forget? You nearly broke my ribs." "I was frustrated," Naruto admitted, looking down at his prosthetic hand. "I didn't know how to handle the pressure. I was trying to prove I belonged here, in this house, in your life." "And now?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Now," he said, turning to face her, "I don't have to prove anything, I'm just here." Tsunade reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand. It was a simple, grounding touch, but it held the weight of everything they had been through. "You know, when the council first proposed this, when I realized I was trapped, I thought it was the end of my life. I thought I would just be marking time until I died, still carrying all that grief." She looked at him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "You were the last thing I expected, Naruto. You were the storm that blew the doors off the house." "I was just a kid who didn't want you to be alone," he said, his voice husky. "You were a hero who didn't know how to let go," she corrected gently. She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. It was a gesture they had mastered over the months, a silent language of comfort and understanding. They didn't need the grand speeches or the displays of power anymore. They had the quiet. They had the mornings, and the shared tea, and the simple fact of existence. "I love you, Tsunade," he said. It wasn't the declaration of a boy with a crush. It was the quiet, absolute statement of a man who had built his life around the woman in front of him. "I know," she murmured, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. And I love you, Naruto. More than I ever thought I was capable of feeling again. She kissed him then, a slow, lingering press of lips that tasted of dango and morning air. It wasn't fueled by the adrenaline of battle or the heat of repressed anger. It was fueled by the comfort of knowing that, no matter what tomorrow brought, they would face it in the same house, under the same roof, bound by a promise that had started as a cage and blossomed into the only freedom they had ever truly known. As they pulled apart, the world outside the compound walls continued to turn. The village rebuilt, the gears of politics ground on, and the future waited to be written. But in the courtyard of the Senju estate, time seemed to pause, held in the quiet, undeniable promise of a life being lived, day by beautiful day. So, Naruto whispered, his nose brushing against hers. Are we going to spar later? Or are you going to let me win for once? Tsunade smirked, her eyes sparkling with that familiar, lethal mischief. In your dreams, brat. Get your gear. You're going to need it. And as Naruto laughed and stood up, reaching down to pull her to her feet, he knew that this simple, sparring, laughing, shared life, was the greatest mission he had ever undertaken, and he wouldn't trade it for all the power in the world. Chapter 17, The Dance of Equals. The Senju training grounds were a testament to the fact that, arranged marriage or not, the two strongest shinobi in the Leaf never lost their edge. By the time they finished their friendly spar, the perfectly manicured lawn looked like it had been hit by a localized artillery strike. Tsunade stood in the center of the crater, wiping a streak of dirt from her cheek, her chest heaving with exertion. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her sleeveless tunic was stained with grass and mud. Naruto lay on his back a few feet away, staring up at the cloudless blue sky, his prosthetic arm lying discarded near the edge of the crater. He was laughing, a genuine, breathless sound that made Tsunade's heart swell. You cheated, Naruto gasped, pointing a finger at her. You used a burst of chakra to propel yourself mid-air. That's not fair. Tsunade walked over, dropping down to sit beside him, her exhaustion washing away the moment she felt the heat radiating off his skin. This is war, Uzumaki. There are no rules in a spar against the Sannin. She reached out, grabbing his hand. He laced his fingers through hers, pulling her down until her head rested on his chest. The rhythm of his heart was steady, powerful. The rhythm of a man who had faced gods and still found his way home to her. We're going to have to fix the lawn again, he noted, his voice vibrating through her. The gardeners are going to start charging us double. Let them, she murmured, closing her eyes. It's a small price to pay for the only place in the village where I don't have to be the Hokage. They lay there for a long time, the silence of the afternoon stretching out around them. It was a stark contrast to the months of tension, the political maneuvering, and the fear that had once defined their interactions. Do you ever think about it? Naruto asked suddenly, his voice quiet. The life we had before? The apartment, the ramen, the solitude? Tsunade traced the lines of his palm with her thumb. Every day. But then I think about the life I have now. The quiet mornings, the chaotic evenings, the way the paperwork doesn't feel like a death sentence when you're sitting in the chair across from me. She looked up, meeting his eyes. I think the person I was back then would be terrified of me now. She'd be worried about the vulnerability, about the risk of losing someone else. Naruto turned his head, his gaze softening. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering on her skin. You didn't lose someone, Tsunade. You gained a partner. Someone who's going to be right here, every step of the way. He shifted, rising up on one elbow to look down at her. The playful, sparring energy was gone, replaced by a deep, unwavering sincerity. We built this, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. We took a situation that was meant to break us, and we turned it into something stronger. I don't need a council decree to know who I am, or who you are to me. Tsunade reached up, pulling him down until their lips met. It was a kiss that tasted of victory. Not over an enemy, but over the circumstances that had tried to dictate their lives. When they pulled apart, Naruto rested his forehead against hers, a slow, crooked smile forming on his face. "I think I'm going to go get us some food," he said, moving to stand up. "If we're going to be Hokage and consort tomorrow, we need to be fed. And I'm not letting you gamble away our dinner money." Tsunade laughed, pushing herself up and dusting off her clothes. "Fine, but you're cooking." "Deal." As they walked back toward the house, the sun began to dip behind the Hokage rock, casting long, golden shadows across the compound. They weren't just two legends walking through a garden. They were a husband and a wife, a team, a future. The political storms had long since faded, leaving behind the quiet, enduring strength of their life together. And as Naruto opened the door to the house, letting her step inside first, Tsunade realized that for all the titles and the legacy, this, the simple, ordinary beauty of their shared life, was the greatest title she had ever held. She was home, and she was never leaving. Chapter 18. The View from the Peak. The evening in Konoha was unusually still. From the balcony of the Hokage's office, the village looked like a constellation of golden embers scattered against the dark canvas of the valley. Tsunade leaned against the railing, the wood cool beneath her palms. She had finally cleared her desk, a feat that, a year ago, would have seemed impossible. Beside her, Naruto stood with his hands resting on the railing, his gaze fixed on the memorial stone that sat just out of sight, though his expression wasn't one of sorrow, it was one of peace. "It's quiet," Naruto noted, his voice barely rising above the rustle of the leaves in the trees below. "It is," Tsunade agreed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Sometimes I still wait for the emergency summons. For the crises, the reports of missing nin, the political headaches. It feels wrong not to be bracing for impact." Naruto turned his head, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. "Maybe we're just getting better at this. Or maybe we're just finally letting ourselves rest," she countered. They stood in silence for a while, the distance between them dissolving. In the early days, this silence had been a battlefield of unsaid words and careful posturing. Now, it was just comfortable. A shared space where they didn't need to fill the air with noise to know they were on the same page. "Do you think they ever imagined it?" Naruto asked, tilting his head toward the Hokage faces carved into the mountain above them. "The first, the second, even Jiraiya? That the village would end up like this?" Tsunade looked up at the stone faces, their features softened by the moonlight. Hashirama always dreamed of a village where people lived without fear. He was an idealist. Tobirama was a pragmatist. And Jiraiya. A soft, nostalgic smile touched her lips. Jiraiya was a dreamer who refused to believe that the cycle of hatred was permanent. She reached out, taking Naruto's hand. "They built the structure, but we're the ones who filled it with life. We're the ones who stopped the fighting within our own walls." Naruto squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing the skin of her knuckles. "We broke the cycle, Tsunade. Not just for the village. We broke it for ourselves, too." He pulled her closer, his shoulder brushing against hers. "I used to think that being the hero meant I had to be alone. That my destiny was to stand at the finish line by myself. But standing here, with you, I realize the finish line isn't a place, it's a person." Tsunade felt her breath hitch. She had spent so much of her life running from loss, from the ghost of her own heart, that she had forgotten how to stand still. But with Naruto, she didn't have to run anymore. He was the anchor. He was the reason the village felt like a home instead of a responsibility. "You changed everything, Naruto," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You walked into the Senju compound, and you didn't just bring chaos, you brought a future." Naruto turned, pulling her into his arms. He didn't say anything, but the way he held her, firm, protective, and entirely devoted, spoke volumes. He pressed his face into her hair, his arms wrapping around her waist, anchoring her to the present. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, his voice low against her ear. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. The war is over, Tsunade. We won." She closed her eyes, letting the reality of his words wash over her. The village lights flickered below, a testament to the peace they had fought for, and the life they were currently living. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And as the wind picked up, swirling the leaves around their feet, Tsunade knew that no matter what storms lay ahead, she was exactly where she was meant to be. They stood there for a long time, watching the village breathe, two legends who had stopped fighting the world and started fighting for each other. The view from the peak was breathtaking, but as Tsunade looked up into Naruto's eyes, she knew that the best part of the view wasn't the village. It was the man standing beside her, holding her hand, and looking at the future with the same fire she felt in her own heart. The story they were writing wasn't over, it was just getting started. Chapter 19. The morning routine. The sun climbed high over the Hokage rock, casting a warm, honey-colored glow into the kitchen of the Senju compound. It was a Sunday, the only day where the village's frantic pace seemed to slow, even for the Hokage. Tsunade leaned against the doorframe, a mug of steaming tea held loosely in her hands. She watched Naruto. He was standing by the stove, his brow furrowed in intense concentration as he attempted to flip an omelet. His prosthetic arm was off, resting on the counter, and he was working with his flesh arm with a level of focus that usually accompanied a high-level jutsu. He looked ridiculous, and he looked perfect. "If you burn it again, I'm just going to walk down to the village and buy breakfast," she said, her voice teasing. Naruto didn't look back, but the corner of his mouth quirked up. "I'm not burning it. I'm adjusting the heat. It's an art form, Tsunade. You wouldn't understand." "I understand that you've managed to set off the smoke alarm twice in 3 weeks," she countered, stepping into the kitchen and wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. He leaned back into her, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of his shirt. He let out a long, contented sigh, dropping the spatula and covering her hands with his. "Okay, fine. Maybe I'm better at saving the world than making breakfast." "You're definitely better at saving the world," she agreed, pressing a kiss to the space between his shoulder blades. They stood there for a moment, enveloped by the quiet rhythm of the morning. It was in these small, unscripted moments that the reality of their life felt most profound. There were no masks to wear, no political strategies to craft, and no eyes watching their every move to see if the Senju Uzumaki alliance was holding up. It was just them. Two people who had spent decades fighting for a future they weren't sure they would ever get to live, finally living it. "We should go to the market later," Naruto said, turning in her arms to face her. "I want to get those ingredients for that stew you like. The one with the extra ginger." "You know, you're becoming quite the domestic strategist," she remarked, reaching up to adjust the collar of his shirt. "It's all about resource management," he teased, his eyes dancing with mischief. "Besides, I like it when you're fed. You're much less likely to throw me through a wall." Tsunade laughed, the sound bright and clear in the sun-drenched room. She took the spatula from him, deftly flipping the omelet, which was, surprisingly, perfectly cooked, and sliding it onto a plate. "I only throw you through walls when you deserve it," she said, handing him the plate. They sat at the small wooden table, the windows open to the sound of birdsong and the distant, cheerful hum of the village waking up. The meal was simple, but it tasted better than any banquet they had ever attended at the daimyo's court. "What are you thinking about?" Naruto asked, noticing the way her gaze drifted toward the window, toward the Hokage tower rising in the distance. "Nothing," she said, and for once, it was the truth. "I was just thinking that for the first time in my life, I don't have to worry about what's waiting for me at the desk. The paperwork will be there tomorrow. The crises will be there if they happen." She looked at him, her expression softening. "But right now, it's just Sunday, and I'm right where I want to be." Naruto reached across the table, his hand finding hers. "Sunday is ours," he promised. And as they sat there, two of the most powerful people in the world, sharing a quiet breakfast in the golden light of the morning, they knew that this simple, ordinary, beautiful peace was the true victory. Everything else was just noise. Chapter 20. The common path. The village market was alive with the chaotic, vibrant energy of a Saturday. Merchants shouted their prices, The scent of roasting chestnuts mixed with the salty tang of nearby fish stalls, and the steady stream of people moved like a river through the cobblestone streets. Tsunade and Naruto walked in the thick of it, not as the untouchable figures of power the village bowed to, but as two people on a simple errand. Naruto wore a plain cloak that obscured his features slightly, and Tsunade had swapped her formal haori for a simpler, sturdy traveling coat. It was a strange feeling, being anonymous in a place where everyone knew their names. "I still can't believe you insisted on the ginger root from this specific vendor," Naruto teased, navigating around a group of children chasing a stray cat. "You could have just sent an Anbu agent, you know." "An Anbu agent wouldn't know the difference between fresh ginger and something that's been sitting on a shelf for 3 days," Tsunade shot back, a playful glint in her eyes. "Besides, I enjoy the walk." "You enjoy the walk, or you enjoy watching me try to carry all these bags without using chakra to float them?" Tsunade laughed, the sound warm and genuine. She reached out and plucked a small bag of dried plums from a passing stall, popping one into her mouth. "A bit of both, I suppose." As they moved through the market, the reactions they elicited were a testament to how far they had come. People still stopped, they couldn't help it, but the frantic, fearful awe of the post-war months had mellowed into something deeper. A quiet, respectful familiarity. They weren't just the Sannin and the hero. They were their leaders, and for the first time, people seemed to understand that these leaders were also, simply, human. They reached the stall of the elderly merchant who provided the ginger for their stew. The man looked up, his face breaking into a wide, toothy grin as he recognized them. "Hokage-sama, Naruto-san, back for the usual?" he asked, already reaching for the finest roots from the back of his stock. "Yes, please," Tsunade said, stepping up to the counter. She chatted with the man for a few minutes about his garden and the recent weather, her tone devoid of the command she usually reserved for council meetings. Naruto stood back, watching her. In these moments, he felt a pride that surpassed any victory in battle. He watched the way she listened, the way she genuinely cared about the life of a villager who lived on the margins of the political sphere. It was the mark of a leader who had found her center. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze as she turned back to him with the bag of ginger in her hand. "Nothing," he said, stepping in to take the bag from her. "Just, you're good at this." "At what?" "Buying groceries, at being yourself," he clarified. They left the market, heading back toward the residential district. The walk took them past the old training grounds, a patch of grass that had been the site of countless battles and sparring matches. Now, it was just a quiet park, with trees swaying in the breeze. They stopped for a moment, looking at the field. It felt like a lifetime ago that they had been fighting here, trying to prove their worth to each other, trying to navigate the trap the council had laid. "It's peaceful," Naruto murmured. "It is," Tsunade agreed. She leaned against the railing of the small bridge that crossed the brook, her hand finding his. "I think that's the best part. Not the peace treaties, not the trade agreements, not the accolades. It's the fact that I can stand here, on a Saturday afternoon, and know that there isn't a shadow lurking around the corner." Naruto looked at her, his expression serious. "We made sure of that, didn't we?" "We did," she said, squeezing his hand. They walked home in the lengthening shadows of the afternoon, the bags of ingredients swinging lightly in Naruto's hand. They weren't the legends the history books would write about. They were just two people who had found a way to bridge the gap between their duty and their hearts. And as the lights of the Senju compound came into view, Tsunade knew that no matter what the future held, the path they were walking, the common, simple, beautiful path, was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 21. The simplicity of belonging the Senju compound welcomed them back with the familiar, quiet embrace of cedar and aged stone. As the heavy doors slid shut behind them, the bustling noise of the market was instantly replaced by the soft rustle of the garden and the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. Naruto set the grocery bags down on the kitchen counter, and for a moment, they both just stood there, letting the day's exertion settle. "I still say we should have just ordered in," Naruto teased. though his eyes were warm as he began unpacking the ingredients. The vendor at the market gave you that look again, you know, the Hokage-sama is doing her own shopping look. Tsunade leaned against the counter, watching him. She had already shed her coat, her movements fluid and relaxed. Let them look. It keeps the village grounded to see me buying ginger, and it keeps me grounded to remember what a carrot costs. She reached out, helping him organize the ingredients. It was a chore, but it felt meaningful, a deliberate act of creating a home out of what had once been a cold, austere space. They worked in a rhythm born of months of shared routines. Naruto handled the heavier chopping, his prosthetic arm moving with practiced grace, while Tsunade took charge of the seasoning, her refined palate ensuring the stew would be perfect. There was no need for conversation. They moved around each other with an intuition that only came from total synchronization. When the stew was finally simmering, filling the room with the warm, fragrant aroma of ginger and savory broth, they moved to the veranda overlooking the garden. The night was cool, the moon hanging full and bright above the rooftops of Konoha. They sat side by side, their shoulders brushing, watching the shadows dance across the koi pond. "Do you ever miss it?" Naruto asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the water. "The adrenaline? The feeling of being the only thing standing between the village and destruction?" Tsunade took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. "I miss the asterisk purpose I used to feel," she admitted, her voice thoughtful. "But I don't miss the cost. I don't miss the funerals, the nightmares, or the constant, gnawing fear that the next mission would be the last. I think." She paused, looking at him. "I think I've spent my whole life waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's hard to just exist without a crisis." Naruto reached over, taking her hand. "You don't have to wait for the next disaster, Tsunade. You're allowed to just be here, with me, without a title." She squeezed his hand, a smile ghosting her lips. "Is that what we're doing, just being?" "It's the hardest mission there is," Naruto replied, his voice brimming with a quiet, joyful intensity. "It takes more courage to be happy than it does to go to war. You have to be brave enough to let the guard down. And you've done it." Tsunade looked at their joined hands, hers, marked by the diamond seal of the 100 healings. His, the hand of a man who had reshaped the world. They were scarred, weathered, and aged by a history that would be remembered for centuries. "I was so afraid of this," she whispered. "Of losing myself in someone else. Of letting the walls come down." "I know," he said, turning to face her, his expression unguarded and earnest. "But look at what we built instead of walls." He gestured to the house behind them, the life they shared, the quiet peace they had carved out of the aftermath of their battles. "We didn't lose ourselves, Tsunade. We found a place where we didn't have to fight to be ourselves anymore." Tsunade leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. The smell of the stew, the cool night air, and the steady, grounding presence of the man she loved. It was everything. It was the simplicity she had spent a lifetime running from, and it was, she realized, the only thing that had ever truly mattered. "You're right," she said, her voice soft in the darkness. "It's a different kind of bravery, isn't it?" "The best kind," Naruto agreed. They sat there for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, content to just be. The village below was sleeping, the future was unwritten, and for the first time in her long, storied life, Tsunade had everything she needed right here, in the quiet, simple belonging of the present moment. Chapter 22. The architecture of peace. The transition from the chaos of the war and the friction of the council to the stability of the present didn't happen in a single, dramatic moment. It was built in the small, repetitive actions of their days. The shared tea, the synchronized patrol of the border, the easy silence in the Hokage's office. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, clean air of early summer. The Hokage Tower, usually a hub of frenetic anxiety, felt different. As Tsunade and Naruto walked down the hallway toward her office, the staff, secretaries, chunin clerks, and guards, didn't scramble to look busy. They greeted them with genuine, relaxed smiles. The fear that had once permeated the halls had been replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm. Tsunade pushed open the doors to her office. Her desk, once buried under stacks of reports, was clear. She had delegated the minutiae, focusing her energy on long-term infrastructure and the strengthening of ties with the other nations. Naruto didn't head to the assistant's desk in the corner. He walked behind the main desk, pulling up his own chair beside hers. A change that had initially caused a stir but was now simply the status quo. "The report from the Sand Village is on your desk," Naruto said, his tone professional yet soft. "Gaara is asking for a formal visit to discuss the new irrigation systems. He wants to know if you'll be attending." Tsunade leaned back, reviewing the document. "I'll go. It would be good for us to travel again. And the sand is always better handled in person." She looked at him, noting the way he navigated the politics of the village. He wasn't the boisterous, impulsive boy anymore. He was thoughtful, measured, and possessed an innate understanding of people that complemented her own strategic mind. He was the empathy to her steel. "You know," she mused, tapping her pen against the desk, "if someone had told me a year ago that I would be planning a diplomatic trip to the sand with you, and actually looking forward to it, I would have bet every ryo I had that they were insane." Naruto grinned, a flash of his old, mischievous self surfacing. "Well, to be fair, I was pretty insistent." "Insistent," she echoed, a smile tugging at her lips. "You were a persistent headache, Uzumaki." "A headache that fixed your life," he countered. "A headache that gave me a reason to fix it," she corrected, her voice lowering. They turned back to their work, but the atmosphere was light. When a knock came at the door, a junior aide with a request for signature, Naruto handled the intake, his tone encouraging and firm, while Tsunade focused on the broader strokes of the agreement. They were a machine, operating with an efficiency that the council could never have engineered. By midday, the work was done. Tsunade felt a surge of energy, not the kind she used to get from a challenge, but the kind that came from a job well done. "We have time before the afternoon meetings," Naruto said, standing up and stretching. "The academy has a graduation ceremony today. I promised I'd stop by and say a few words. To the new recruits. Yeah, the ones who are just starting. It's a big day for them." Tsunade stood, smoothing out her haori. "Then we should go. I think it's important for them to see us. Not just as symbols, but as the people who are actually going to be leading the world they're graduating into." They walked out of the tower and into the midday sun. The village was vibrant, the streets packed with parents and family members heading toward the academy. As they walked, they didn't walk as the Hokage and the hero. They walked as two people who were deeply invested in the future of the place they called home. When they entered the academy courtyard, the murmurs of the crowd died down, but they were quickly replaced by polite applause and genuine smiles. Naruto walked up to the podium, his presence commanding but approachable. He spoke not of battles, or power, or duty, but of connection, of the importance of the people beside you, and the responsibility of protecting the peace they were all building together. Tsunade watched from the side, a profound sense of serenity washing over her. She realized then that they weren't just maintaining the leaf, they were shaping its soul. They were building an architecture of peace, brick by brick, day by day, using the only tools that mattered: honesty, patience, and the unwavering strength of a bond that had been forged in the fire and cooled in the quiet. As the ceremony concluded and the air filled with the cheers of newly graduated genin, Naruto walked back to her, his hand slipping into hers. "They'll be okay," he said, looking at the kids with a quiet, fierce pride. "They will," Tsunade agreed, looking at him, "because we're making sure of it." They turned away from the crowd, walking back toward the Senju compound. The day was far from over, but for the first time in her life, Tsunade wasn't rushing toward the next crisis. She was walking toward the rest of her life, and she couldn't wait to see what they would build next. Chapter 23. The weight of memory. The study in the Senju compound was a room that had once felt like a prison. In the early days of their arrangement, Tsunade had spent countless hours at the heavy mahogany desk, using the work to avoid the reality of the man sleeping down the hall. Tonight, however, the room felt different. Tsunade was sorting through a locked drawer, clearing out old, forgotten correspondence from the council. The cold, clinical directives that had forced their marriage into existence. Her hand brushed against the original scroll, the official document that had bound them together. It was a stark, bureaucratic piece of parchment, filled with legal jargon meant to control her, to contain the wild card of the Uzumaki, and to stabilize a village that was fracturing at the seams. She pulled it out, unfurling the paper under the soft glow of the lantern. It felt like an artifact from a different civilization. A lifetime ago, reading these words would have made her blood boil. Now, the threats of political leverage and the subtle, coercive language felt hollow. The door creaked, and Naruto stepped in. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply walked over, his presence filling the room with a familiar, grounding warmth. He looked over her shoulder, his eyes landing on the scroll. "Still have that?" he asked, his voice low and amused. "I found it while cleaning out the drawer," she said, her thumb tracing the red wax seal of the council. "It's funny. When I look at this now, I don't see a cage. I see a mistake they made." Naruto circled the desk and leaned against the edge, looking down at her. "They thought they could force us into a box, and instead, they just opened the door to this." Tsunade looked up at him. "They wanted a figurehead. They wanted a pawn they could maneuver. They never understood that you don't maneuver a force of nature." She took a match from the small box on the desk, lit the edge of the scroll, and dropped it into the bronze ashtray. They both watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to gray dust. The words, the mandates, the threats, all of it vanished in a matter of seconds. "Is that the last of it?" Naruto asked. "That was the last of it," she confirmed. She stood up, moving away from the desk. The room felt lighter, the air cleaner. She walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. "I spent so many years defined by what I had lost, Naruto," she said, her voice steady. "I defined myself by the void left by Nawaki, by Dan, by Jiraiya. I thought that being the Hokage meant living in that void. I thought I was honor-bound to be lonely." Naruto joined her at the window, his hand resting on the small of her back. It was a touch so natural it was almost unconscious. "You were just surviving," he said gently. "There's a difference between living and surviving." "I'm living now," she said. She turned to face him, the moonlight catching the silver in her eyes. "And I have you to thank for that. You didn't just break the trap the council set. You broke the trap I set for myself." Naruto reached out, cupping her face. His skin was warm, his eyes dark with an emotion that had long since transcended the politics that brought them together. "I didn't do it alone, Tsunade. You were the one who let me in. You were the one who decided that your heart was worth fighting for." He kissed her, a slow, deep press of lips that tasted of evening air and the promise of tomorrow. It wasn't the kiss of a forced arrangement. It was the kiss of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own life, and a man who had realized his destiny wasn't to be a savior, but to be a partner. When they broke apart, Tsunade leaned into him, letting her head rest against his shoulder. The weight of the past, the guilt, the fear, the heavy expectations of the Senju name, was gone. "What do you want to do tomorrow?" she asked, her voice soft. Naruto laughed, a low, rumbling sound against her. "Whatever you want. We have the whole day." "I think I'd like to just be here," she said. "No missions, no meetings, just us." "That sounds like the best plan I've ever heard," he agreed. They left the study, turning off the light and leaving the room to the shadows. As they walked down the hall toward their shared bedroom, Tsunade didn't look back at the desk. The documents were ash, the council was obsolete, and the ghosts were finally quiet. She wasn't the Hokage, or the Sannin, or the grieving survivor. She was just Tsunade, and for the first time in her life, she knew that was exactly enough. Chapter 24. The quiet ordinary the morning sun filtered through the paper screens of the Senju compound, casting long, lazy shadows across the floor. For the first time in as long as Tsunade could remember, there was no sharp knock at the door, no urgent scroll delivery, and no phantom pressure of the Hokage's mantle weighing on her shoulders. It was, quite simply, a Saturday. Tsunade woke slowly, savoring the stillness. Beside her, Naruto was still asleep, his breathing deep and rhythmic. He looked younger in sleep. The lines around his eyes, etched by years of battle and the heavy burden of the world, seemed to soften. She watched him for a while, feeling a profound sense of wonder. Not long ago, the idea of waking up next to someone, of sharing this level of intimacy, would have terrified her. It would have felt like an opening, a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Now, it felt like the only sanctuary she had ever really known. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and pulled on a light robe. The house was quiet, save for the faint, distant sound of the village waking up, the chime of a bell from the academy, the low rumble of carts on the main street. She walked to the kitchen and started the water for tea, moving with a grace that was entirely her own. She didn't need to be the fifth Hokage today. She didn't need to be the legendary Sannin. She just needed to be Tsunade. A few minutes later, she heard the soft thud of footsteps. Naruto appeared in the doorway, his hair a chaotic mess, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He stopped when he saw her, a small, tired smile spreading across his face. "You're up early," he mumbled, shuffling over to wrap his arms around her waist, burying his face in her hair. "It's a beautiful morning," she replied, leaning back into him. "I didn't want to waste it staring at the ceiling." "We could just stay in bed," he suggested, his voice muffled against her neck. "That sounds like a top-tier mission to me." Tsunade laughed, turning in his arms to face him. "As tempting as that is, I want to take a walk. I want to see the village, not as the Hokage, but just as someone who lives here." Naruto pulled back, his eyes brightening. "A walk? No destination? No route planning?" "No destination," she promised. They spent the next hour getting ready, the process easy and comfortable. There was no rush, no tactical preparation, just two people preparing for a day that belonged entirely to them. When they stepped out into the streets of Konoha, the air was warm and smelled of blooming cherry blossoms. They kept a low profile, not out of necessity, but out of preference. They walked hand in hand, letting the crowd flow around them like a river. It was an unremarkable Saturday for anyone else, but for them, it was extraordinary. They passed the academy, where a group of young genin were practicing their kunai throws, their shouts echoing in the courtyard. They stopped at a small stall to buy a skewer of dango, sharing it as they sat on a bench near the fountain. As they watched the villagers go about their business, the shopkeepers haggling, the children playing, the old couples walking slowly through the park, Tsunade realized that this was what the peace felt like. It wasn't the silence of a treaty signing or the absence of war. It was the noisy, chaotic, beautiful hum of people living their lives without fear. "It's weird," Naruto said, following her gaze. "I spent so long trying to protect this place that I never really stopped to look at it. I was always too focused on the next threat, the next disaster." Tsunade leaned her head on his shoulder. "That was your burden, Naruto. And you carried it well. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore." He looked at her, his expression softening. "I know, and I'm starting to think that the best part of the peace isn't just the absence of war. It's the ability to finally just be." They stood up and continued their walk, meandering through the backstreets and the quiet, tree-lined avenues of the residential district. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The comfort of their presence was enough. As the sun began to set, casting a golden, amber glow over the village, they found themselves back at the gates of their compound. They stopped and turned back to look at the village one last time. The lights of Konoha were starting to twinkle, a tapestry of warmth against the encroaching twilight. It was a home. The home they had fought for, the home they had built, and the home they would continue to nurture, day by day, year by year. "You know," Tsunade said, her hand tightening in his. "I think this was the best mission we've ever been on." Naruto grinned, that familiar, infectious smile that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. Agreed. Same time next Saturday? Same time next Saturday, she promised. They turned and walked through the gates, the door clicking shut behind them. The world outside could keep spinning, with all its politics and its power games. But in here, in the quiet, remarkable ordinary of their life, they had found everything they had ever been looking for. And for the first time, the future didn't look like a challenge to be overcome. It looked like a life to be lived. Chapter 25. The seeds of tomorrow. The Sunday morning was soft, the air smelling of damp earth and the sweet, lingering scent of jasmine from the garden. Tsunade sat on the Ingawa, a book resting unread in her lap, watching Naruto work. He was in the corner of the courtyard, his sleeves rolled up, his prosthetic arm set aside. He was digging into the soil with a small hand trowel, his movements slow and methodical. He had decided, quite suddenly, that the courtyard needed a proper garden. Not just the ornamental shrubs and koi pond that had defined the Senju estate for generations, but something that produced life. Something that grew. You're going to get dirt under your fingernails, Tsunade noted, her voice amused. Naruto didn't look up, but he chuckled. That's the point, isn't it? I spent so much of my life surrounded by dust and ash. I want to see something grow from my own hands. He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, leaving a smudge of dark earth against his skin. He looked up at her, his eyes bright with a simple, unburdened happiness. I'm thinking tomatoes, maybe some herbs. Things that take time. Things that you have to care for, not just protect. Tsunade set her book aside and stood, walking over to join him. She knelt on the grass, the hem of her robe brushing against the soil. She watched him work for a moment, the juxtaposition of the man who had reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the 5 nations and the man who was now obsessed with the proper depth for a tomato seed. You know, she said, reaching out to steady the small sprout he was carefully maneuvering into the hole. Hashirama used to love gardening. It was his way of reminding himself why he built the village. Naruto stopped, his hand lingering near hers. I think I get it now. It's not about the monument. It's about the soil. If you don't tend to the roots, the whole thing eventually collapses, no matter how strong the walls are. He covered her hand with his palm rough and warm. We spent so long building the walls, Tsunade. Maybe it's time we focus on the roots. Tsunade looked around the courtyard. For years, this place had felt like a tomb, a repository for the Senju legacy, for the memories of her brother and her lover, for the cold expectations of a clan that had dwindled to nothing but a name. Now, it felt like a beginning. The roots are strong, she said, her voice soft but firm. I think they're stronger than they've ever been. They worked in silence for the better part of the hour, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant, cheerful calls of the village. It was a mundane labor, but it felt monumental. It was an investment in a tomorrow they were both planning to be part of. When they finished, the courtyard looked different. It was still the Senju estate, but it was warmer, lived in, and imbued with the quiet promise of life. Naruto washed his hands in the small water basin, then turned to her, pulling her close. The afternoon sun caught the golden highlights in his hair, and for a moment, Tsunade saw the boy he had been and the man he had become, both of them, layered in the same gaze that looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way no one else ever had. What do you think? He asked, gesturing to the garden. I think it's the best thing we've done since the trade agreements, she replied, a genuine smile lighting up her face. High praise, Hokage-sama. Indeed. She took his hand, and they walked back toward the veranda, sitting down to share a pot of tea. The weight of the world felt very far away. The Hokage Tower, the council chambers, the threat of war, the ghosts of the past, they were all still there, woven into the fabric of their lives, but they no longer defined the perimeter of their existence. We have a lot to look forward to, Naruto said, staring out at the new garden. Not just next week or next month, but years of watching things grow. Tsunade leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. She didn't look at the Hokage faces on the mountain, nor the village sprawling out below. She looked at the garden. I spent so much of my life waiting for the end of the story, she whispered. I'm glad we decided to write a new one instead. Naruto tightened his arm around her, holding her close, grounding her in the present. The seeds were planted, the roots were taking hold, and for the first time, the future wasn't something to be survived. It was something to be cultivated, tended to, and watched as it bloomed into the beautiful, quiet ordinary life they had finally made their own. Chapter 26. The harvest of time. The summer twilight settled over Konoha like a soft, velvet shroud. From the veranda of the Senju compound, the village was a collection of flickering warm lights, a constellation anchored to the earth. Tsunade sat with a cup of tea, her legs tucked under her, watching Naruto. He was kneeling in the dirt again, not working this time, but simply observing the small green shoots they had planted together. The moonlight caught the silver in his hair, a subtle reminder of the years that had passed, the battles fought, and the heavy prices paid. They're growing, he said, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze. Tsunade set her cup down and moved to sit beside him on the edge of the veranda. She didn't mind the dust this time. She reached out, resting her hand on his shoulder. It takes patience. I used to think patience was a weakness, Naruto admitted, turning to look at her. I thought if I didn't push, if I didn't force the world to change, nothing would ever get better. But looking at this, it changes how I see everything. How so? I don't have to change the world every day, Tsunade. Sometimes, I just have to tend to the garden. And if I do that well enough, the rest of it takes care of itself. Tsunade looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who had finally stopped carrying the weight of the entire world on his back. He wasn't the Hokage's assistant, he wasn't the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki, and he wasn't the savior of the ninja world. He was just Naruto. And in the quiet of this courtyard, that was the most powerful thing he could be. I spent so long being the last Senju, she said, her voice soft. I thought I was the end of a line, a guardian of a history that was slowly turning to dust. I thought my legacy was to sit in that tower and keep the ghosts from fading. She reached out, lacing her fingers through his. But you changed the narrative. You didn't just walk into my life. You walked into the story and started rewriting the pages. And now, I don't feel like the end of anything. I feel like the beginning. Naruto smiled, and it was a look of pure, unadulterated peace. Then let's keep writing. We have plenty of pages left. They sat in silence as the stars began to poke through the dark canopy of the night. It wasn't the heavy, laden silence of their early days, nor the anxious silence of the council meetings. It was a comfortable, earned silence. It was the silence of two people who had nothing left to prove to the world, and nothing left to hide from each other. Do you ever think about the council? She asked, a small, mischievous smile touching her lips. About what they would say if they saw us now? Two of the most powerful people in the world, sitting in the dirt, talking about tomato seeds? Naruto laughed, a low, rumbling sound that felt like home. They'd probably have a stroke. They'd want to form a committee to analyze the soil quality and draft a regulation on how to plant a garden. Tsunade let out a sharp, genuine laugh. You're probably right. I'm glad we didn't invite them. We didn't need them, Naruto said, his gaze fixed on hers. We never did. We had everything we needed right here from the start. We just had to be brave enough to realize it. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. The night air was cool, but the space between them was filled with a heat that had nothing to do with chakra and everything to do with the simple, profound reality of belonging. I love you, Tsunade, he whispered. I love you, Naruto. They didn't need to say anything else. The garden would grow, the seasons would change, and the village would continue to thrive under their guidance. But in the quiet of the Senju estate, beneath the gaze of the moon, the only thing that mattered was the steady beat of their hearts, synchronized in the dark. The story they were living wasn't a legend, it wasn't a myth, it was a life. And as Tsunade closed her eyes, letting the peace of the evening wash over her, she knew that this simple, beautiful, ordinary moment, was the greatest victory she had ever known. Chapter 27. The ripple effect. The Hokage Tower had ceased to be a fortress of solitude. It had become, over the passing months, a place of convergence. Tsunade sat at her desk, but the stacks of paper had diminished. She was reviewing a proposal for a new orphanage in the southern district, a project she and Naruto had spearheaded together. When the door opened, she didn't look up with the defensive sharpness she used to reserve for intruders. She smiled before the visitor even entered. Naruto walked in, carrying 2 paper bags that smelled unmistakably of pork broth and ginger. He didn't knock. He didn't wait for permission. He just walked to the desk, set the food down, and leaned over to kiss her temple. "The lunch rush is starting," he said, his voice light. "I thought you might need a break from the infrastructure reports." "You're a lifesaver," Tsunade said, pushing her chair back and rising. "The orphanage board is persistent, but they lack vision. They want walls. I want a home." "Then we'll give them a home," Naruto replied, his hand finding the small of her back as they navigated toward the door. They walked through the village, and the difference in the way people reacted to them was no longer a matter of tension or surprise. It was a rhythm. Shopkeepers nodded, not in forced reverence, but in a familiar, respectful acknowledgement. Children waved, and Naruto waved back with that wide, genuine grin that had always been his trademark. They reached Ichiraku Ramen, the stools occupied by a mix of shinobi and civilians. When they stepped under the awning, Tuchi and Ayame looked up. "Hokage-sama, Naruto." Ayame beamed, quickly clearing 2 spots. "The usual?" "Please," Naruto said, hopping onto the stool. As they ate, Tsunade watched the way the village functioned around them. There was no whispering behind hands about the nature of their relationship. There was no speculation about the arranged status of their union. They had been a couple long enough, and consistent enough, that the village had simply accepted it as a fundamental truth of Konoha's new era. Sakura Haruno walked by, pausing when she saw them. She didn't bow with stiff formality. She leaned against the counter, her expression soft and amused. "You two are becoming quite the fixture," Sakura said, her eyes traveling from Tsunade's relaxed posture to the way Naruto was teasingly trying to steal a piece of pork from her bowl. "It's called having lunch, Sakura," Tsunade remarked, though her tone was entirely devoid of malice. "You should try it sometime when you aren't buried in hospital records." "I might take you up on that," Sakura laughed. She looked at them, really looked at them, and her smile widened. "It's good to see you both like this. The whole village. It feels different. People aren't looking over their shoulders anymore. They're looking at you, and they see something stable." Naruto stopped mid-chew, looking at Sakura. "We're just living, Sakura. That's all we ever wanted." "And that," Sakura said, pushing off the counter, "is exactly what the village needed." After she left, the silence that settled between them was not empty. It was full of the realization of what they had created. Their relationship wasn't just a private sanctuary. It was a public declaration that peace wasn't just a political state. It was a personal one. "She's right," Tsunade said, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "The ripple effect. When we stopped fighting the inevitable, everyone else stopped bracing for the impact." Naruto reached out, his hand covering hers on the counter. "We set the tone, Tsunade. We built the example." "It's a strange thing, being an example," she mused. "I spent my life trying to be the outlier. The gambler. The drunk. The one who didn't fit. And now you're the anchor," Naruto said, his voice quiet, vibrating with sincerity. "And I'm right here with you." They finished their meal, paid the bill, and walked back toward the Hokage Tower. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the path. "Back to the office?" Naruto asked. "Back to the office," Tsunade confirmed, "but first." She stopped, turning to him in the middle of the street. She didn't care who was watching. She reached up, adjusting his collar, her fingers lingering on his skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Naruto leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "For what?" "For being the ripple." They stood there for a moment, 2 legends in the heart of the village, surrounded by the ordinary beauty of the life they had fought to build. The future was vast, and the challenges would always exist, but as they turned and walked toward the tower, hand in hand, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it not as two, but as one. Chapter 28. The gentle horizon. The late afternoon in the Hokage Tower was quiet, a stark contrast to the urgency that had once defined every hour spent within its walls. Tsunade sat at her desk, not buried in work, but looking out the window at the vibrant life of the village below. The sunlight, dipping toward the horizon, painted the Hokage rock in hues of amber and violet. Naruto was across from her, leaning back in his chair with his hands behind his head. He wasn't bored, he was simply present. He had become a master of the quiet moments, a skill that had eluded him for most of his youth. "You know," he said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence, "I was thinking about the academy students today. The ones we saw graduation day." Tsunade turned her chair to face him. "And they don't have the same look in their eyes that we had," Naruto said, his brow furrowed in thought. "When we were genin, the world felt like it was constantly on the verge of ending. We were training to survive. These kids, they're training to live." Tsunade nodded, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "That is the greatest success of our administration, Naruto. We didn't just rebuild the walls. We changed the foundation. We made it possible for them to dream of things other than duty." She stood up and walked over to the window, placing a hand against the glass. "It's a heavy legacy, to be the ones who finally stopped the wheel from spinning. But standing here, watching them, it makes all the struggle feel small." Naruto stood and walked over to her, his presence a warm, solid weight at her side. He didn't look at the village, he looked at her. "We did it together. That's the part that sticks with me. The Senju Uzumaki alliance. The political marriage. All that noise. It faded, and what was left was just us. We were the catalyst." "We were," she agreed. She looked up at him, noting the maturity in his features, the way the lines of his face had softened into a roadmap of experiences they had shared. "I spent so long fearing that being Hokage meant being alone. I thought it was a path you walked by yourself. I never let you walk it alone," he reminded her, his voice low and firm. "Even when you pushed, I pushed back. Even when you wanted to hide, I made sure you were seen." Tsunade let out a soft laugh, resting her forehead against his chest. The fabric of his shirt was familiar, smelling of the soap they used in the clean, outdoor air of the village. "You were relentless. It was exhausting." "It was necessary," he countered, a playful glint in his eyes. They stood there for a long time, the sun sinking further behind the mountains, casting the office into soft, deepening shadows. There was no need to rush, no need to attend to urgent matters. The village was safe, the peace was holding, and their own lives were a tapestry they were still actively weaving. "What do you think of the house tonight?" Naruto asked, breaking the silence. "The garden." "The garden is fine," she replied, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "But I think I'd rather just be with you. No gardening, no paperwork, no politics, just us." "That," Naruto said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, "is the best plan I've heard all day." They left the office, walking out into the cooling evening. The air was crisp, and the village was settling into the rhythmic hum of nightfall. They walked through the streets, not as figures of authority, but as two people who had found a destination that wasn't on any map. As they entered the Senju compound, the silence of the garden greeted them like an old friend. The tomatoes and herbs they had planted were growing, tiny green promises of a future they were building together. They stopped on the veranda, looking out at the koi pond. "Do you ever think about the future?" Tsunade asked, her hand slipping into his. "Not the village's future, but ours?" Naruto tightened his grip, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "I think that we've already arrived at the future. It's not some distant goal anymore. It's right here. It's this moment. It's waking up tomorrow. It's the life we've chosen to lead." Tsunade looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she felt no trace of the grief that had once defined her existence. She felt only the present, the warmth of his hand, the quiet of the night, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "I think you're right," she whispered, "we're home." And as the stars began to blanket the sky above them, reflecting in the dark water of the pond, they knew that the story they were writing wasn't just about power, or legacy, or duty. It was about the simple, profound courage it took to choose happiness, day after day, in a world that had tried to dictate otherwise. They turned, walking into the house together, the door closing softly behind them, sealing away the noise of the world and leaving them in the gentle, unbroken horizon of their own making. Chapter 29. The rain and the remembrance. The rain descended on Konoha in a steady, rhythmic drumming that transformed the village into a watercolor painting of gray stone and vibrant green leaves. It was the kind of evening that demanded a warm fire and a heavy blanket. A night for the world to slow down and listen to the water against the roof. Inside the Senju compound, the atmosphere was perfectly insulated. The sliding doors were closed, the scent of cedar and old paper mingling with the faint, comforting aroma of stew from earlier in the day. Tsunade sat near the hearth, watching the flames dance. She had a book in her hands, but her eyes hadn't moved past the first paragraph in 10 minutes. She was listening to the rain, letting the sound wash over the edges of her mind. Naruto entered the room, his hair damp from a quick trip to the storage shed. He shed his outer cloak, his movements fluid and unhurried. He didn't head for the kitchen or the study. He walked straight to the hearth and sat down on the floor beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "It's a downpour out there," he said, staring into the fire. "Reminds me of the days when we didn't have anywhere to go but up." Tsunade closed her book and set it on the small table. "You mean when we were fighting for survival?" "I mean when the rain felt like it was trying to wash the village away," he corrected. "Now, it just feels like it's cleaning it. Getting everything ready for the morning." Tsunade reached out, running a hand through his damp hair. The water was cold, but his skin was warm, vibrant with life. "You have a poetic streak, Uzumaki. I'm not sure where you picked that up." "Maybe I learned it from the company I keep," he teased, leaning his head against the edge of the low table where her hand rested. She smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. The firelight flickered across his features, highlighting the strength in his expression. A strength that was no longer sharpened for battle, but softened for peace. "I was thinking about the old days," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "About how I used to sit in this exact spot, thinking that the only way to protect the village was to hold it together with iron. I thought if I blinked, everything would shatter." "You were carrying a lot of ghosts," Naruto said gently. "It makes sense that you wanted to hold on tight." "And you," she continued, looking at him with intense focus. "You spent so long trying to save everyone that you forgot to save a place for yourself." Naruto turned his head, capturing her hand in his. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her palm. "That changed when I found you. Or maybe, when I forced my way into your life." "You didn't force your way in," she murmured, a trace of a smile on her lips. "You nudged. And then you pushed. And then you simply refused to leave until I realized that you were already home." The rain outside intensified, a sudden gust of wind rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. It was a stark, beautiful contrast. The chaos of the storm outside and the absolute stillness within. "I like it when it rains," Naruto said, pulling himself up to sit closer to her. "It makes the house feel like a fortress. Just the two of us, cut off from the rest of the world." "Is that all this is to you, a fortress?" "No," he said, his gaze deepening. "It's the sanctuary. The place where the war doesn't exist. The place where I'm not the hero, and you aren't the Hokage. We're just us." Tsunade leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls behind them, but the only thing that felt real was the warmth of his breath against her skin. "I think," she whispered, "that I've spent more time in this house in the last year than I have in the last decade. And for the first time, it actually feels like it belongs to me, because I share it with you." Naruto didn't answer with words. He reached up, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs brushing the high points of her cheekbones. The tenderness of the gesture hit her with more force than any battlefield challenge ever could. It was an acknowledgement of their journey, from the forced alliance that had felt like a cage, to the partnership that had become their salvation. They sat there for a long time, listening to the rain, the world outside forgotten. The ghosts of the past were quiet tonight, silenced by the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man she loved. She realized then that the peace they had built wasn't fragile. It wasn't something that could be blown away by a storm or shattered by a political dispute. It was built into the foundation of their life, into the way they looked at each other, and into the simple, unspoken agreement that no matter how hard it rained, they were on the same side of the door. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice soft in the dim light, "we have the delegation from the sand." "Tomorrow," Naruto agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. "But tonight is just for us." And as the fire burned low, casting a golden glow over the room, Tsunade knew that there was nowhere else she would rather be. The village was safe, the future was secured, and the girl who had once been afraid of the silence had finally learned to cherish the sound of the rain. Chapter 30. The clearing the morning after the storm brought a rare, crystalline clarity to Konoha. The rain had washed away the humidity, leaving the air crisp and smelling of wet pine and damp earth. Sunlight flooded the Senju compound, turning the dew on the garden leaves into thousands of tiny, brilliant diamonds. Tsunade woke before the sun had fully crested the horizon, a habit born of decades of duty that she had never quite been able to shake. But for the first time in her life, the early hour didn't bring the dread of a mountain of paperwork or the fear of a crisis. She turned on her side, watching the steady rise and fall of Naruto's chest. He was deeply asleep, his face relaxed, the tension of the previous night's firelight conversation completely erased. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of blonde hair from his forehead. He stirred, a low rumble of contentment in his throat, and his hand instinctively found hers. He didn't wake, but his grip tightened, a silent, unconscious tether that grounded her. "We are here," she thought. "And we are safe." A while later, the kitchen was alive with the familiar sounds of their morning ritual. The water was boiling for tea, and the scent of miso soup drifted through the house. Naruto was at the small wooden table, reviewing a brief document about the upcoming delegation from the sand. He looked focused, yet entirely unburdened. "Gaara's arrival is scheduled for mid-morning," Naruto said, looking up as Tsunade set a bowl of rice in front of him. "He sent word that they're traveling light. No formal escort, just his core advisors." Tsunade sat opposite him, taking a sip of her tea. "That's Gaara. He always prefers efficiency over pageantry. It's one of the reasons I appreciate him." "We're ready, though," Naruto added, tapping the folder. "The irrigation infrastructure plan is sound. If we implement the support systems, it'll cut their water waste by nearly 20%. Tsunade watched him. The boy who had once run on pure instinct had become a man of detail and foresight. It was a transformation she had witnessed firsthand, day by day, sitting across this very table. "You've done a remarkable job with these files, Naruto," she said, her voice sincere. "You've balanced the data with the human element better than any of the council elders ever did." Naruto smiled, a genuine, humble expression. "I just listened to what the people actually needed, Tsunade. You taught me that. You taught me that the biggest problems are usually solved by the smallest details." "I taught you?" she teased, arching an eyebrow. "I seem to remember you being quite the stubborn student." "I was," he agreed, picking up his chopsticks. "But I had the best teacher in the world." The conversation shifted, the weight of the political meeting dissipating as they focused on the present. They talked about the garden, about the way the soil looked after the heavy rain, and about the small, inconsequential things that made up the fabric of their daily existence. There was a profound comfort in the transition. In the past, the shift from home to Hokage had been a brutal tearing of her identity. She had donned the mantle of leadership like armor, rigid and unforgiving. Now, it felt like an extension of herself, a role she played, yes, but one that no longer erased who she was when the door closed. When they left the compound, walking toward the Hokage Tower, the village was already bustling. The street was clean, the vendors were setting up their stalls, and the children were rushing toward the academy. As they walked, they didn't hold back. Naruto held her hand, his palm warm against hers. It wasn't a statement or a performance, it was just the natural order of their lives. When they reached the stairs of the tower, they stopped for a moment, looking out over the village. The sun was fully up now, casting a golden light on the rooftops and the memorial stone in the distance. "Ready?" Naruto asked. Tsunade looked at him, then at the village that had been their burden and their joy. She felt a deep, abiding strength, not the kind that comes from chakra or power, but the kind that comes from having a place to return to. "I'm ready," she said. They climbed the steps together, not as two people carrying the weight of the world, but as two people who had finally learned that the weight was only heavy if you tried to carry it alone. The day would bring its meetings, its negotiations, and its challenges, but as they entered the office and took their seats, Tsunade knew that whatever the delegation brought, they would handle it. They were a team, a partnership, and a life, and for the first time in history, the Senju compound wasn't just a place where ghosts lived, it was a place where they were building a future. Chapter 31. The shadow of the wind. The office was filled with the low, steady hum of late morning activity. When the doors finally opened to admit the cage, the change in atmosphere was instantaneous. Gaara, the cage of the sand, stepped into the room with his usual quiet grace. He didn't bring an entourage of guards or the stifling formality that usually accompanied cage-level summits. He came with a handful of advisors and the calm, unwavering presence that had defined his leadership since the end of the war. Tsunade stood, stepping from behind the desk to meet him. She didn't greet him as a superior or a subordinate, but as a peer. "Gaara," she said, offering a hand, "it's good to see you again, you made good time." "The travel was uneventful, Tsunade-sama," Gaara replied, his voice level. His eyes flickered briefly, taking in the office. The lack of clutter, the light streaming through the windows, and the presence of Naruto standing easily at Tsunade's side. Naruto didn't stand in the corner or wait for a summons. He stood at the edge of the desk, his demeanor professional yet relaxed. "Cage," Naruto acknowledged with a slight nod, "it's good to have you here." Gaara turned his gaze to him, and for a moment, the stoic lines of the young Cage's face softened into something approaching a smile. "Naruto, I see the rumors of Konoha's stability were not exaggerated." "We've been working hard on that," Naruto said. They moved to the conference table, the documents for the irrigation plan laid out. As the meeting commenced, the dynamic became clear to anyone observing. Tsunade handled the broader geopolitical implications, the long-term trade agreements, and the security concerns, while Naruto provided the on-the-ground assessment, the logistical details, and the empathetic connection that bridged the gap between Konoha's resources and the Sand's needs. They were a singular force. When Tsunade made a point, Naruto didn't contradict her, he expanded on it, filling in the gaps with the nuance that only someone who had walked the village streets as a villager could provide. When Naruto proposed a bold, unconventional solution, Tsunade didn't shoot it down, she refined it, turning his raw energy into actionable policy. Gaara watched them, a quiet observer who had seen the village at its lowest points and its highest. He noticed the way they didn't need to look at each other to communicate. A simple shift in posture or a subtle glance was enough to bridge the distance. Halfway through the meeting, as the advisors were busy reviewing the maps of the new irrigation routes, Gaara leaned back, his gaze lingering on the pair. "I remember the council meetings during the transition period," Gaara said, his voice quiet enough to cut through the shuffling of papers. "They were filled with apprehension. People feared that a partnership forged from necessity would eventually crumble under the weight of expectations." Tsunade paused, her pen hovering over the draft. "They were wrong." "Indeed," Gaara noted, his gaze thoughtful. "I have observed many alliances in my time as Cage. Most are built on treaties, gold, and mutual defense. Yours is." Different. You function not as two separate entities, but as a single unit. Naruto looked at Tsunade, then back to the cage. We realized early on that if we were going to lead, we couldn't just lead the village. We had to lead each other, too. We had to trust that the person next to us was the only one who truly understood what it meant to carry this. Tsunade reached out, placing a hand on the folder of the irrigation plans, but her gaze remained locked on Gaara's. The council wanted a figurehead and a weapon, Gaara. They didn't realize that by putting us together, they were creating the one thing they couldn't control. A partnership that was completely, entirely our own. Gaara nodded slowly, a look of profound respect on his face. The sand has benefited from your cooperation. But more than that, the world has benefited from the example you have set. It is rare to see power wielded with such harmony. The meeting continued, but the air in the room felt lighter. By the time they reached the final agreement, a comprehensive plan that would secure the water supply for the southern desert for the next decade, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. As Gaara and his advisors stood to leave, the cage stopped at the door. He turned back, looking at them one last time. The wind in the desert shifts, but the stone of the leaf remains, Gaara said, his eyes conveying a message that went beyond politics. I am glad to see that the stone is in good hands. When the doors clicked shut, the office returned to its quiet rhythm. Tsunade let out a long, slow breath, leaning back in her chair. He was always observant, she remarked. He's a good friend, Naruto said, walking over to the window. He looked out at the village, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley. And he's right, you know. About what? About the harmony, Naruto said, turning to look at her. We did a good thing today, Tsunade. Not just for the sand, for us. Tsunade looked at her desk, then at the empty chairs where the advisors had been. She felt a deep, abiding sense of fulfillment. Not because of the trade agreement, but because of the way they had achieved it. We did, she agreed, her voice soft, and I think, for the first time, I'm ready to stop worrying about what everyone else thinks of our partnership. Because it's working. She stood up, walking over to join him at the window. The view from the Hokage Tower had changed. It wasn't just a view of the village anymore. It was a view of their future, wide and open, waiting for them to step into it, together.